Welcome again to Latin American History 3590. Today we are going to be discussing the era of Spanish colonialism in Latin America. To your left, you will see a depiction of the flag of Spanish conquistadors with the crown of Castile. This flag was used by Hernan Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and other Spanish conquerors of the New World. On the right, you will notice a map depicting the vastness of the Spanish Empire in the New World, in blue. This empire stretched from modern-day Canada all the way to Argentina. Now, post-conquest, three dynamics mark the beginning of Spanish colonialism in Latin America. Number one, the rise of a strong nobility or aristocracy, also known as entitled classes. The rise of intercontinental state bureaucracies to check power struggles between the entitled and privileged classes and the government of Spain. And the role of religion, race, and culture as a central component in the justification and philosophy of conquest and resettlement. In this lecture, we are going to examine each of these dynamics. Concerning the rise of a strong nobility or aristocracy, also known as entitled classes in the Americas, many of the Spanish conquistadors were mercenaries, soldiers, and adventurers. Most men were seeking wealth and nobility, or God, glory, and gold, as we discussed last week. As early as 1520 in Spain, commoners with financial resources could actually purchase titles of nobility. Therefore, conquistadors in the New World sought a life that mirrored the life of the nobility in Europe. This included a large residence, horses, servants, a wife, and the ability to offer hospitality to relatives and friends. To fulfill this dream, the settlers needed control over indigenous labor. This led to many abuses of indigenous labor that lasted into the 20th century and even continue today. In this week's film, Embrace of the Serpent, rubber barons are continually shown to exploit native labor. This is an extension of colonialism's attempt to control indigenous systems of labor in the Americas. Now, in order to control Indian labor, conquistadors exploited existing indigenous systems of tribute, in which conquered people paid a price or tax of goods or services as an acknowledgement of submission or for protection. The main source of income for indigenous empires were tribute and taxation. The conquered regions paid tribute to the emperor, and the citizenry paid taxes, with the exception of priests, nobles, miners, orphans, invalids, and beggars. For the Aztecs, tribute systems typically included warrior costumes and shields, tropical feathers, incense, paper, foodstuffs, and animal products. The picture on your right is an Aztec record of tribute from the Codex Mendoza. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, superficial gold and precious mineral reserves were quickly depleted, so the Spanish turned to the Indians for enrichment through their existing tribute systems. The Spanish literally used the established tribute systems of indigenous empires to siphon off the production of indigenous communities. This process actually enabled indigenous peoples to keep many of their practices and traditions intact. This was because the Spanish depended upon these local practices for their own material accumulation and wealth. Now, in addition to tribute, access to indigenous labor took many forms. Most common were Indian slavery and the encomienda. The encomienda was a central institution to the establishment of colonial society. The encomienda developed as a product of the conquest of the Americas. In Spain, The encomienda functioned much like a feudal land grant, whereby the lord gained access to the land and labor of the resident population. When the encomienda was transplanted to the New World when Columbus arrived in 1492, it did not confer property of any kind to the conquistadors. The Indians were not legally given as slaves, and the land remained the property of the Spanish crown. What was granted to the conquistadors was access to the labor of the indigenous peoples. The encomendero was a person, usually a former conquistador, and they were responsible for the material well-being of his Indians, Christianizing the Indians under his control, and providing military services to the Spanish crown. In Latin America, the encomienda was a transitional form of economy falling between feudalism and capitalism. It was economic wealth extraction through political institutions, not the accumulation of private property. The encomienda was really a hybrid institution. It was feudal because it was based on a grant based on the authority of the crown in return for the political and military loyalty of the encomenderos, but it was also used in a very economic and capitalistic manner to gain wealth. This was done by exploiting Indian labor in various forms. For instance, the Indians had mines that they were working before conquest. The Spanish just greatly expanded this push for the production and extraction of precious metals in these mines. Indian labor was also used to construct large, elaborate Spanish-style houses, as well as for agricultural production and local manufacturing. Manufacturing based on artisan crafts such as weaving blankets and clothes. And after livestock were introduced to the New World, there were all kinds of leather crafts constructed from cattle hides. Encomienda Indians also produced necessities such as tallow, soap, and candles. The encomienda eventually became the subject of intense debates, which were fueled by the black legend of Spanish conquest, in which Spain was demonized for their atrocities in the Americas. Eventually, it was clear that a power struggle was going to take place. The encomienda was strongly protected and desired by the colonists and former conquistadors, but it was eventually resisted by the crown and the Catholic Church, and the system officially dissipated. However, the encomienda structure was already firmly in place in the New World, and the exploitation of indigenous labor continued. These next two dynamics are interrelated. The encomienda caused a power struggle to erupt between the Spanish crown, entitled classes in the New World, and the Catholic Church that emerged around this idea of access to indigenous labor and the mistreatment of indigenous peoples became a political issue. Eventually, this power struggle resulted in increased regulation and bureaucracy in the New World. For instance, the laws of the Indies were based off accounts of brutality against the Indians in the New World and gave certain rights to indigenous people. However, these laws were largely unenforceable, so labor abuses and atrocities against indigenous communities continued. In 1512, the laws of Burgos were the first set of laws governing the behavior of Spanish settlers in the Americas, particularly in regard to native Indians. They forbade the maltreatment of Indians and endorsed resettlement that included attempts to convert the native population to Catholicism. Upon the failure of the laws, they were replaced by the new laws of 1542. Now, the legal thought behind these laws were the basis of modern international law. Taking advantage of their extreme remoteness, the Spanish colonists revolted when they saw their power being reduced. This forced a partial revoking of these new laws. Later, weaker laws were introduced to protect the indigenous people, but records show their effect was limited as the laws were simply unenforceable in the Americas, and the restored encomendieros continued to increasingly abuse their native Indian workforce. Now, Francesco Hernandez Giron, who you see on your right, was a Spanish encomendero in the Viceroyalty of Peru who protested these new laws in 1553. The accounts of Spanish atrocities against native people in the New World were most famously made public by Bartholomew de las Casas, a 16th century Spanish colonist and priest who recorded specific incidents of brutality in his book, A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. The book was originally a set of letters to the Viceroyalty of Spain, imploring the crown to take steps to protect the indigenous population from Spanish colonists. As we discussed, eventually the crown took notice, enacting the laws of the Indies. Although part of an encomendero's responsibility was to Christianize the Indians under his care, this responsibility was often just a way to rationalize Indian exploitation. However, at least legally, the Spanish crown did take seriously its obligation to Christianize the inhabitants of the New World. The Patronato Real, in combination with the 1493 Papal Bull, gave Spain title to the discovered lands of the New World. This Papal Bull, which is a kind of religious legislation, expressly meant that the Christianizing mission, at least in theory, should play a central role in the Spanish settlement of the Americas. Therefore, the role of religion, race, and culture were central components in the justification and philosophy of conquest and resettlement in the Americas. In the New World, religion became the key component in the power struggle between the conquistadors, who were considered an entitled class or new nobility, and the Spanish crown that controlled an intercontinental state bureaucracy in both Spain and in the Americas. Again, it was control over Indian labor that was really at the heart of these power struggles. In the case of the Americas, religion was used as a way to rationalize native exploitation. When exploitation and the destruction of the New World reached brutal thresholds, as was reported by Las Casas, the Spanish crown attempted to intervene under the basis of religion with the laws of the Indies, which again were largely unenforceable an entire world away. As the Indian population began to drastically decline in the Americas, the encomienda system quickly became the subject of intense debate, and Spanish conquistadors and their offspring interbred with natives, creating a new mestizo or Hispano race in the Americas that were classified by a hybrid Spanish caste system called las castas. The term casta describes mixed race individuals in Spanish America, resulting from these unions between Spaniards, American Indians, and Africans. Casta paintings emerged as part of the 18th century artistic tradition in colonial Latin America and were portraits, often of families, that depicted the complex racial mixing of the people of the New World. Today, Casta paintings are useful for understanding elites in colonial Latin America and their attitudes towards non-elites and mixed-race people in the Americas. And on the right, you could see a photograph depicting 16 of those racial groupings of the Casta systems in the New World. So before we go, just a couple of reminders on upcoming assignments. Your final research paper proposal is due Monday, July 6 by 11:59 p.m. in Canvas. You can view the assignment instructions in Canvas under the course assignments module. Paper number 1 is due Friday, July 10th by 11:59 p.m. The assignment prompt and expectations are also available to view in Canvas. And finally, please remember that your student choice film review is due the week we watch that film. You may pick an upcoming film of your choice to review, so don't procrastinate on this assignment. It will sneak up on you. Other than that, have a safe and fun holiday weekend.